The year was 1941. The world stood on the edge of chaos, and even the most confident leaders of the Axis powers were beginning to feel the weight of uncertainty. Adolf Hitler, whose armies had swept through Europe with terrifying speed, was now turning his anxious gaze toward Africa. The continent, far from the heart of Europe's battlefields, was quickly becoming the weak link in his grand vision, a place where the tides of war could change everything. At first, Africa seemed like an afterthought. Why should Hitler worry about the deserts of Libya or the highlands of Eritrea when his empire stretched from the North Sea to the Balkans? Yet, beneath the golden sands and rugged terrain, something far greater was unfolding. The British Empire, battered but not broken, was preparing to strike back. Across the harsh deserts of North Africa, British and Commonwealth forces were pushing westward with fierce determination, reclaiming territory and pride after months of setbacks. For Benito Mussolini, the self-proclaimed heir to Rome's ancient glory, the African campaign had been meant to showcase Italy's power. Instead, it became a series of humiliating defeats. His armies, under-equipped and poorly commanded, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Cities fell. Soldiers surrendered, and morale crumbled. The man who once dreamed of a new Roman Empire now faced the bitter reality of collapse. And this, perhaps more than anything, terrified Hitler. He knew that if Mussolini's empire in Africa were to fall, the Mediterranean would open to British control. Italy itself could be exposed to invasion, and the entire balance of Axis power could begin to crumble from within. The war in Africa was no longer a sideshow, it was the Achilles heel of the Axis. But while the Axis powers scrambled to hold their ground, the Allies were finding new strength in unity. From the dusty apes of Egypt to the secret war rooms of London and Washington, a new strategy was taking shape. Men and machines were on the move, driven not just by orders, but by conviction. Africa, long overlooked by the world's great powers, was about to become the stage for one of World War II's most pivotal campaigns. This is the story of how a continent became a turning point, a tale of courage, miscalculation, and the relentless will to fight against the odds. From the sun-scorched dunes of Libya to the jungles of East Africa, the battles fought here would shape the destiny of nations and determine who would rule the Mediterranean. If you love uncovering the hidden battles and human stories behind the world's most dramatic moments, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a journey through history's most defining hours. Each week, we bring you closer to the people, the choices, and the moments that changed the world forever. Stay with us, because the story of Africa, the Axis Achilles heel, has only just begun. As Hitler brooded over the growing instability of his southern ally, the war in Africa was entering a decisive phase. The vast desert, once dismissed as empty and irrelevant, had become the battleground for empires. Beneath the burning sun and endless dunes, the fate of the Mediterranean and perhaps of the entire Axis alliance was being tested by men who fought not for glory, but for survival. In the wake of Italy's repeated failures, a new kind of warfare began to unfold across the North African sands. British and Commonwealth troops, hardened by months of desert struggle, had transformed retreat into resurgence. Their momentum carried them westward after the stunning capture of Tobruk, a fortress city whose fall shook the Italian command to its core. The man leading this advance was General Richard O'Connor, a calm, methodical soldier whose mind worked like a chess player's, always several moves ahead, always searching for the unexpected angle that would tip the balance of war. O'Connor understood that victory in the desert depended on more than brute force. The desert, with its open expanses and unforgiving heat, rewarded cunning over size, flexibility over arrogance. He had already seen what the Italians could do and what they could not. Their massive fortifications and static defenses, so imposing on maps, had crumbled under pressure from fast-moving, lightly supplied British armoured units that struck like lightning, appearing out of nowhere and vanishing into the dunes. Now, as his forces pushed toward Benghazi, O'Connor was ready to risk everything on one final, audacious maneuver. His plan was simple in design but perilous in execution. Rather than continuing along the predictable coastal route, where Italian forces could prepare ambushes among the hills and settlements, O'Connor proposed something radical: to send his tanks and mobile infantry deep into the desert, crossing miles of desolate terrain to strike from behind. If successful, the move would trap the Italian 10th Army between two advancing fronts, cutting off their retreat and forcing their surrender. But if it failed, if supplies ran dry, or if his men were discovered too soon, the British advance could collapse in the very sands they sought to conquer. The British command in Cairo hesitated. It was an operation that defied convention, a gamble on logistics as much as courage. Yet the situation was too promising to ignore. Intelligence reports revealed that Italian commander Rodolfo Graziani, shaken by previous defeats, had lost confidence in his ability to defend forward positions. He was already pulling his forces back towards Sirte. Hoping to regroup and hold a new defensive line, O'Connor saw opportunity in that retreat. Every mile the Italians withdrew created confusion, opened gaps, and stretched their supply chains thinner. It was the perfect moment to strike not head-on, but from the shadows of the desert itself. The 7th Armored Division, known as the Desert Rats, would take the lead. Their crews were veterans of the harsh terrain, men who had learned to read the sands like sailors read the sea. They knew that the desert could kill faster than bullets, radiators clogged by dust, engines failing in the heat, men lost in blinding sandstorms. But they also knew the power of surprise. The Italian command, reliant on slow reconnaissance and rigid planning, would never expect a full-scale armored column to emerge from the trackless expanse beyond their flank. As the operation was set in motion, Tobruk became a vital hub of preparation. Convoys arrived daily with food, fuel, and ammunition, building the supply lines that would sustain the desert push. Mechanics worked through the night, coaxing life into tanks battered by weeks of battle. Pilots flew reconnaissance missions over the barren plains, mapping routes where even compasses could falter. Each decision carried enormous risk, but there was a sense of inevitability about it, a quiet understanding among the men that they were part of something larger than themselves. By early February, O'Connor's forces began their silent march. From Mekili, they moved southward across the desolate wastes toward Messus, their engines rumbling softly under the stars. The desert at night was both haunting and beautiful, an ocean of silence broken only by the sound of treads on sand and the faint rustle of wind over canvas. The men endured thirst, fatigue, and the gnawing uncertainty of what awaited them at journey's end. Yet, with every mile, they drew closer to the Italian lines, closer to the trap O'Connor was setting. Meanwhile, the Italians remained largely unaware of the storm approaching from the south. They had grown used to British advances following predictable paths, hugging the coast and moving in clear daylight. Reports of British patrols deep in the interior were dismissed as exaggerations. Graziani, consumed by doubts and desperate to preserve what remained of his command, continued to retreat, his army scattering across the roads to Benghazi. What he did not realize was that those very roads were becoming snares, and the desert, once his shield, was now turning against him. Back at British headquarters, messages crackled through radios in coded bursts. Supply columns pushed forward, carrying the precious fuel that would decide whether O'Connor's gamble would pay off or die in the dunes. Officers traced routes on maps with trembling fingers, calculating distances, estimating fuel consumption, and praying that their assumptions would hold. This was not just a battle of armies, it was a test of endurance, precision, and nerve. As dawn broke over the Libyan horizon, the first signs of success began to appear. Italian outposts, surprised and disoriented, reported sightings of British armor far inland, too far, they thought, to be real. Panic spread through the ranks as rumors of encirclement grew. Columns of Italian trucks jammed the narrow desert roads, struggling to escape an invisible enemy closing in from all directions. What followed would become one of the most remarkable tactical victories of the North African campaign. The British had turned the desert itself into a weapon, using its emptiness as cover and its silence as their ally. The encirclement of the Italian 10th Army near Benghazi would not only cripple Italy's military presence in North Africa, but also send shockwaves through the Axis command. For Hitler, who had once dismissed Africa as a sideshow, it was a rude awakening, a reminder that even the smallest corner of the map could become the undoing of an empire. And for O'Connor and his men, it was proof that ingenuity and courage could overcome even the harshest odds. The sands of Libya, once symbols of desolation, now bore the marks of victory and the dawn of a new phase in the war. While the British were driving westward across the desert with growing confidence. On the other side of Europe, Benito Mussolini was facing a storm of his own making. The illusion of fascist glory, once painted across posters and parades, was now cracking beneath the weight of failure. His armies in Africa were collapsing. His men in Greece were frozen in the mountains. And his promises of conquest had turned into whispers of defeat. The Deuce, once hailed as the strongman of Italy, was now a man surrounded by doubt, suspicion, and the faint scent of betrayal. Mussolini had built his regime on spectacle, on the idea that willpower alone could shape destiny. He had believed that bold words and grand gestures could make up for Italy's lack of resources and industrial strength. But the desert and the mountains had proven immune to speeches. The Italian soldiers sent to Libya and Albania were not the legions of a new Rome. They were young men unprepared for the realities of modern war, facing supply shortages, outdated equipment, and commanders who barely understood the terrain. When reports of defeat reached Rome, Mussolini's pride refused to accept the truth. He blamed his generals, his ministers, anyone but himself. In late January 1941, as the British closed in on Benghazi and the Greeks held firm against Italy's invasion, Mussolini decided on a gesture that would be both dramatic and absurd. He ordered members of his government under the age of 45 to report to Albania, not as observers, but as soldiers, ministers, bureaucrats, and party officials traded their fine suits for military uniforms and boarded transport planes for the frozen Balkan front. The move was meant to rekindle the spirit of fascist heroism, to prove that the ruling elite were willing to share the hardships of the common soldier. But to those who watched from Rome, it looked more like desperation, a ruler grasping at symbols while the world around him burned. Among the officers and soldiers in Albania, the reaction was mixed. Some laughed quietly at the sight of polished politicians struggling to march through the snow. Others felt insulted, seeing in these men not comrades, but intruders playing at war. The front lines were no place for political theater, and the presence of these officials only deepened resentment. They arrived with no experience, no understanding of command, and no respect for the hierarchy of the army. Instead of lifting spirits, they became a burden, one more reminder of how disconnected Rome had become from the men actually fighting and dying for it. Even within Mussolini's inner circle, patience began to fray. Count Gelli, Mussolini's own son-in-law and foreign minister, had grown increasingly skeptical of the war. He had warned the Deuce months earlier that Italy's military was not ready for the campaigns in Africa or Greece. But his advice had been ignored. Now, Forced to trade the comforts of his office for a tent in Albania, Sano found himself muttering to friends that the regime was committing suicide one order at a time. His diary from that winter would later reveal a portrait of chaos: officers without orders, soldiers without boots, and morale frozen as solid as the mountain passes they tried to hold. In Rome, the ripple effects were immediate. The government was leaderless, its ministries half empty, its bureaucracy paralyzed by fear. Those who remained behind watched the spectacle unfold with disbelief. Mussolini's decision to send his own officials into battle was seen by some as an act of courage, by others as madness. Whatever the intent, it had one undeniable consequence: it isolated Mussolini completely. The men he depended on to govern Italy were gone, and those who might have challenged his authority were now too far away or too afraid to speak. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler was watching closely. To him, Mussolini's troubles were more than a political embarrassment, they were a strategic threat. The German leader had long understood that Italy was the weak link in the Axis chain, bound to Germany more by ideology than by strength. He mocked the Italian military in private, calling them undisciplined and unprepared. Yet he knew that Italy's loyalty was crucial. Without Mussolini, the alliance could fracture. Without Italy's territory, the Mediterranean would become vulnerable. As Mussolini's prestige sank, Hitler began quietly taking control. German transport planes carried supplies to Albania to prop up the faltering Italian campaign. Luftwaffe squadrons redeployed from Norway to Sicily, striking British ships and mining the Suez Canal. It was a reluctant partnership, one born not of respect but necessity. For every ton of aid Germany sent south, its frustration with its ally deepened. Mussolini had promised triumph and delivered crisis, and now his failures were threatening to drag Germany into yet another front. For Mussolini himself, the irony was cruel. The man who had once dreamed of being an equal partner to Hitler was now reduced to a dependent, his armies surviving only through German support. His grand visions of empire of Italian legions ruling Africa and the Mediterranean had dissolved into a series of desperate telegrams begging for reinforcements. The speeches in the Piazza Venezia, once echoing with applause, now seemed hollow. The people who had once believed in his strength began to whisper doubts. In the cafes of Rome and Milan, soldiers' mothers asked why their sons were dying in distant deserts and frozen mountains for victories that never came. Yet, despite everything, Mussolini refused to yield. His pride, forged in years of propaganda and adulation, would not allow him to admit defeat. He spoke of destiny, of sacrifice, of temporary setbacks that would lead to ultimate triumph. But deep down, even he must have known that something had changed. The aura of invincibility that had carried him to power was gone. The empire he had promised was unraveling, and his closest allies both in Rome and Berlin were beginning to see him not as a leader, but as a liability. In the bitter winter of 1941, as O'Connor's tanks moved silently across the sands of Libya and Greek troops pushed the Italians back into Albania, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Italy's war machine was breaking apart, and with it, the myth of Mussolini's greatness. The dictator who once dreamed of reshaping the world now found himself trapped in the very web of ambition he had spun, surrounded by loyalists too frightened to tell him the truth and enemies too patient to destroy him quickly. The battlefields of Africa and the Balkans had exposed what propaganda had hidden for years, that the foundation of fascist Italy was not strength, but illusion. And as that illusion faded, the Axis alliance began to tremble. Across the rugged highlands of East Africa, the sound of battle echoed through valleys once untouched by war. The British 4th Indian Division, hardened by the unforgiving conditions of the desert and the mountains, pressed forward with a quiet but relentless determination. Their target was Agordat and Barentu, two critical towns in Eritrea that stood as symbols of Italian control in the region. Taking them would not only weaken Mussolini's colonial hold, but also send a clear message. The tide in Africa was shifting. The fighting was fierce, brutal, and personal. The Italians, though weakened by months of pressure, were determined to hold their ground. They had dug into the steep hills, using every inch of the landscape to their advantage. Artillery thundered across the ridges, and the dry air carried the sharp scent of gunpowder and dust. The Indian soldiers moved with precision, scaling rocky, slender enemy fire, their uniforms blending into the harsh terrain. They came from across the vast British Empire, from Punjab, from Bengal, from the far corners of India, men who had never seen Africa before, now bound together by duty and survival. Agorda felt first, but not easily. The defenders fought with stubborn resolve, retreating only when the situation became hopeless. In the aftermath, the once bustling town was scarred by shellfire. Its walls cracked and its streets littered with the remnants of war. But for the British and Indian troops, victory meant more than territory, it meant momentum. Every step forward was a reminder that the once invincible Italian East African Empire was beginning to crumble. Further south, another offensive was unfolding. General Alan Cunningham, commanding from Kenya, led a coordinated assault into Italian Somaliland. The campaign there was as unforgiving as the desert war to the north, intense heat, endless plains, and a determined enemy who fought not for victory but for dignity. Cunningham's men faced logistical nightmares, long supply line, unreliable terrain, and the constant threat of ambush. Yet, the operation pressed on with remarkable discipline. For many of the soldiers under Cunningham's command, the war in Africa was unlike anything they had imagined. It was not the grand, sweeping conflict of Europe, with tanks and vast armies clashing across open fields. It was a campaign of endurance, of slow advances through punishing environments, of small victories that came at great cost. Each village captured, each river crossed, brought them closer to breaking the backbone of Italian resistance in the region. The Italians fought bravely, but morale was waning. They had been cut off from supply routes, surrounded by hostile terrain, and abandoned by a command structure that had lost its sense of direction. Messages from Rome urged them to hold their positions at all costs, but those costs were mounting by the hour. Hunger, exhaustion, and disillusionment crept through their ranks. Soldiers who had once marched under Mussolini's banners with pride now fought merely to survive another day. When Berenta finally fell, it was after days of grueling combat. The town, nestled among rocky hills, had been turned into a fortress. Italian troops, supported by colonial units, mounted a desperate defense. But the British and Indian forces proved unyielding. They fought street by street, house by house, until the resistance collapsed. The Italian flag that once flew over the garrison was replaced with the Union Jack, fluttering in the dry, relentless wind. The victory in Eritrea was more than a military success, it was symbolic. It marked the unraveling of Mussolini's African ambitions. For years, he had boasted of creating a new Roman Empire that stretched across the Mediterranean and deep into Africa. Now, those dreams were being dismantled piece by soldiers who had traveled thousands of miles to fight in lands they had never known before. Meanwhile, news of the British and Commonwealth advances rippled through Axis command centers. In Berlin, Hitler's concern deepened. Every loss in Africa weakened the Axis position in the Mediterranean, exposing their southern flank and threatening vital supply lines. The Führer, who had once dismissed Africa as a secondary theater, now realized that the war there could shape the entire course of the conflict. Back in Rome, Mussolini faced mounting humiliation. His armies were retreating on every front, his colonies were slipping away, and his officers were losing faith. Even his closest advisers began to question his leadership, though few dared to say it aloud. The victories in Eritrea and Somaliland were not just military setbacks, they were cracks in the facade of fascist Italy's power. For the Allied troops, the campaign was far from over. Ahead lay the daunting task of pushing deeper into enemy territory, securing supply routes, and preparing for the next phase of operations. But for now, there was a sense of vindication, a belief that discipline, courage, and cooperation had triumphed over arrogance and overreach. The men of the 4th Indian Division and Cunningham's forces had proven that the will to fight for something greater than conquest, for liberation, for justice, for the promise of peace was stronger than any empire built on pride and propaganda. The red sands of East Africa had witnessed yet another turn of history. What began as Mussolini's dream of domination was now unraveling before the world's eyes. In its place, a new chapter of determination and resilience was being written by those who refused to bow to tyranny, no matter how distant the battlefield or how harsh the struggle. While the sands of Africa still trembled under the weight of battle, across the Atlantic Ocean, another kind of war was unfolding, a quieter one, fought not with rifles and tanks but with diplomacy, secrecy, and vision. In early 1941, deep within the corridors of Washington, representatives from Britain and the United States gathered for a series of clandestine meetings that would come to shape the entire course of World War II. They were known simply as the ABC Conference's Anglo-American Staff Discussions, but their significance would reach far beyond the walls where they were held. At the time, the United States was not yet formally at war. The memory of World War I still lingered in the hearts of its people, and the nation's policy of isolationism ran deep. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood what many of his citizens did not yet see, that the flames consuming Europe would eventually threaten the entire world. Britain was holding on by sheer willpower, bloodied but unbroken, and Roosevelt knew that without help, even that indomitable island might not stand forever. Thus, as Hitler's gaze turned toward Africa and the Mediterranean, Roosevelt began laying the political and strategic groundwork for an alliance that could withstand the storms to come. The British delegation, led by some of the most capable military minds of their generation, arrived in Washington under utmost secrecy. They carried with them not just maps and reports from the front, but also the weight of a nation fighting for survival. Across the table sat their American counterparts, officers and planners who, though officially neutral, shared the same growing concern about the future of the free world. The discussions were cautious at first, layered with the diplomatic carefulness of two nations bound by shared ideals but separated by circumstance. Gradually, the tone shifted as reports from Africa arrived detailing British advances in Eritrea, Somaliland, and the Western Desert. An understanding began to crystallize. The battles fought under the scorching sun were not isolated events. They were threads in a much larger tapestry. If the Axis powers were to be defeated, it would require more than victories in Africa or Europe. It would demand unity of purpose, of strategy, and of command. It was during these very meetings that the seeds of the Germany First strategy were planted. Despite Japan's growing aggression in the Pacific and the uncertainty surrounding America's eventual entry into the war, both nations agreed that the heart of the Axis lay in Europe. Defeating Germany was the key to breaking the entire alliance. If Berlin fell, Rome would collapse, and Tokyo would stand alone. The logic was simple but profound, and it would define Allied strategy for the rest of the conflict. The conversations were meticulous, stretching late into the night. They debated logistics, manpower, industrial capacity, and naval power. The British brought hard-earned lessons from the front: the cost of supply shortages in the desert, the difficulty of maintaining air superiority over distant territories, the brutal efficiency of German tactics. The Americans, though untested in this new global war, brought fresh resources, vast production potential, and a growing realization that neutrality was no longer a shield against tyranny. As they worked, the faint hum of typewriters echoed through the rooms, recording the frameworks of what would become a unified command structure. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of fragmented national efforts, the Allies would coordinate as one, sharing intelligence, strategy, and responsibility. It was not an easy agreement to reach. Questions of leadership, jurisdiction, and pride lingered in the air, yet necessity forged consensus. The British, seasoned but strained, needed American strength. The Americans, cautious but pragmatic, saw in Britain a partner of unmatched experience and resolve. Outside those rooms, the world was changing faster than anyone could control. In Norfolk, General O'Connor's forces continued their daring push across the desert, while Italian morale withered in the heat of defeat. In East Africa, Cunningham's campaign was dismantling the remnants of Mussolini's empire. The Allied victories in these distant lands lent a quiet confidence to the discussions in Washington. They were proof that the Axis could be beaten not just on paper, but on the ground, in real battles fought by real men. Roosevelt followed the progress closely, understanding that every victory in Africa strengthened his hand at home. He faced fierce opposition from isolationists in Congress, who accused him of leading the country toward another foreign war. But with each passing month, public opinion shifted. Reports of Axis aggression, bombings, and atrocities began to erode the illusion of distance. The world was shrinking, and the United States could no longer pretend to stand apart from it. When the APU meetings concluded, their results were not announced to the world. There were no public statements, no grand declarations. Yet, behind the scenes, a powerful alliance had been born. For the first time, the future leaders of the Allied war effort had committed at least in principle to fighting as one. It was a fragile agreement, dependent on trust that had not yet been tested. But it marked a turning point. The path ahead was uncertain. The United States still stood outside the war, and the challenges of building a unified command would only grow as the conflict expanded across continents. But the foundation had been laid. The men who gathered in Washington that winter had looked beyond the immediate crises of Africa and Europe. They were planning for the long war, the war that would decide the fate of the modern world. As winter turned to spring, and the battles in the deserts of Libya and the hills of Eritrea raged on, the silent alliance forged in Washington began to take shape. It would soon transform from secret documents and cautious promises into the most formidable coalition the world had ever seen, an alliance born not of conquest, but of shared conviction that freedom, once threatened, must always find defenders willing to stand together, no matter the distance or the cost. By the spring of 1941, the world had grown smaller, its borders blurred by the relentless spread of war. In Washington and London, the partnership that had begun in secrecy was now evolving into something far more profound. The United States and the United Kingdom, though not yet bound by formal alliance, had begun to share their most valuable weapon of all: information. In dimly lit rooms filled with clattering typewriters and humming machines, a new kind of battle was being fought not with guns or tanks, but with ciphers, intercepts, and human brilliance. Among the most remarkable breakthroughs was the decryption of Japan's Purple Code machine. This device, a complex system used by Tokyo to send encrypted diplomatic messages, had long baffled Allied cryptanalysts, but through relentless effort and ingenuity, American and British intelligence teams succeeded in breaking it. Suddenly, the hidden conversations of Japanese diplomats, once sealed behind layers of coded language, began to reveal themselves line by line. What they read confirmed what Roosevelt and Churchill had already suspected. Japan's ambitions in Asia were far from contained. The winds of war were shifting eastward, and the Pacific was becoming a new frontier of danger. Yet the intelligence shared between Washington and London extended beyond Japan. It became a symbol of trust of two great nations learning to think and act as one. Messages were exchanged daily, carrying updates from Africa, Europe, and Asia. Reports from the British campaigns in Eritrea and Somaliland mingled with news of American naval patrols in the Atlantic. For the first time, a transoceanic alliance was forming, one that would soon draw in millions of people under a single, united purpose. Meanwhile, the wider world seemed to move in chaotic synchrony. In Greece, Prime Minister Ioannis Metaxas, who had defied Mussolini's invasion with fierce determination, died unexpectedly, leaving his nation politically unstable just as German pressure began to mount. In Asia, Japan positioned itself as a mediator of peace in Indochina, even as its armies tightened their grip across the region. Everywhere, the illusion of neutrality was crumbling. The lines between aggressor and victim, between occupied and free, were growing painfully clear. In the deserts of North Africa, the struggle raged on. Though British forces had achieved spectacular victories, new challenges loomed on the horizon. German reinforcements, under the command of a brilliant and daring general named Erwin Rommel, were arriving to bolster the Axis front. His presence would soon transform the war in Africa into a brutal contest of strategy, endurance, and willpower. The early triumphs of O'Connor and Cunningham would soon face their greatest tests, and the outcome of those future battles would echo across continents. Back in Europe, Hitler's ambitions continued to expand. His mind, restless and consumed by visions of conquest, turned toward the east, where he planned an invasion that would dwarf anything the world had yet seen. But while his gaze shifted toward the Soviet Union, the Allies were quietly strengthening the foundation that would one day bring his empire to ruin. The plans drawn in Washington, the victories in Africa, the growing intelligence networks, all were parts of a larger strategy taking shape, one that would unite nations and peoples in the fight against tyranny. The world of 1941 was not one of certainty, but of transformation. The seeds of global alliance, planted in the shadows of diplomatic meetings and on the sands of distant battlefields, were beginning to take root. The cooperation between Britain and America was no longer a matter of convenience. It was a matter of survival, and though no one could yet predict the long and harrowing road ahead, there was a sense that something irreversible had begun, that the forces of freedom, though scattered and wounded, were rising with purpose. The breaking of codes, the forging of alliances, and the resilience shown across continents were more than acts of strategy. They were reminders of the human spirit's capacity to adapt, to connect, and to fight for something greater than itself. From the soldiers trudging through the deserts of Libya to the analysts decoding messages in secret rooms, each played a role in shaping the course of history. Together, they were building the unseen network that would one day turn the tide of war. As the story of Africa, the Axis at Chill's heel, draws to a close, we are reminded that history is never just a sequence of battles and treaties. It is a reflection of choices of courage under fire, of cooperation in uncertainty, of unity forged in adversity. The early months of 1941 were not merely a prelude to greater conflict. They were the crucible in which the future Allied victory was forged. The trust built between nations, the breakthroughs in intelligence, and the determination to fight for freedom all began here, in these fragile but fateful moments. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of World War II's most defining chapters. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more untold moments from the past, stories of courage, strategy, and humanity in the face of chaos. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell. Every week, we uncover the hidden corners of history, where decisions made in secret shaped the fate of the modern world. Because understanding history is not just about remembering the past, it is about recognizing how the courage of a few can change the destiny of many. Stay curious, stay inspired, and join us again for the next story that shaped our world.